Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 331, Safety and Unsafety at Summer Camp. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And since it's the middle of June and our fiscal year ends at the end of June, there's an argument that the Jewish year, Rosh Hashanah, the day that we call Rosh Hashanah, is actually the new year of the fiscal year in Judaism because it's actually the seventh month, not the first month. July is the seventh month in our calendar, and it's the beginning of the fiscal year. So you learn something, and maybe an appreciation of learning something interesting like you do on Judaism Unbound, you might consider giving an end-of-year financial contribution to sustain this work. And we're excited to say that your gift will be doubled this year because we have a matching gift that all new giving up to $10,000 will be doubled by this matching gift. And if that weren't enough, we're having a raffle where any amount over $7 that you give from now to the end of June, but also if you've already given that in this fiscal year, you are automatically entered in that raffle as well. And there's awesome Judaism Unbound merch that you can win in that raffle, as well as a free Yeshiva class. So really, if you have always been meaning to make a small donation to Judaism Unbound, it's a meaningful time for us to have a sense of how many people are really invested in the work that we're doing. And we're so grateful to you for being invested in it. And thank you very much for considering a donation. You can do that at www.judaismunbound.com/donate. And now let's get into our conversation, which really has a little bit to do with where some of the money goes that you donate, because we've been part of a fellowship program along with the organization that our guests today are involved with, New Voices Magazine. They have had a fellowship program where together we hire fellows who are college students to work part-time for us and part-time to write for New Voices Magazine. And we've been very excited to have these amazing fellows over the years that have done incredible, extraordinary, important work for us at Judaism Unbound, and that have also done amazing writing for New Voices Magazine, which is the official magazine of the Jewish Student Press Service, the only Jewish and justice-focused magazine by and for Jews ages 18 to 24. And our very first Judaism Unbound New Voices fellow was one of our guests today, Rena Yehuda Newman, who is now the editor-in-chief of New Voices Magazine. So we are so excited for so many reasons to be having this conversation. Now, the conversation is both exciting and also on a very serious topic, because among the other things that New Voices Magazine does is that it does do some investigative reporting, which is not so common in the world of the Jewish press. And New Voices Magazine is doing some of that investigative work, specifically on the questions of whether various programs aimed at Jewish young people are both great and do important things, and also that have elements to them that are potentially damaging to young Jews. An article that New Voices Magazine just came out with recently, and that's on the homepage of their website right now, is entitled Investigation: How Jewish Summer Camps Are Damaging LGBTQ plus Youth. The article is by Julia Hegele, who is one of our guests today, along with Rena Yehuda Newman, the editor-in-chief of New Voices Magazine. Now, we should note, as we'll discuss, that we all think very highly of Jewish summer camp. We love Jewish summer camp. It's important. It's wonderful. And that's the reason why, if there are concerns that things are happening there that are not as they should be, then it's actually good to surface that so that those fixes can be made. A few words of introduction for our guest today. Rena Yehuda Newman is the editor-in-chief of New Voices Magazine. They are a Jewish transgender writer and comics artist. Rena Yehuda Newman is a recent graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison with a BA in history and self-publishes zines and comics celebrating the intersections of queer and Jewish identity. Our second guest today, Julia Hegele, is the author of this investigation. Julia Hegele is a theater maker, culture writer, and well-seasoned camper, originally from Denver, now based in Scotland. Julia Hegele is about to start a master's program in arts politics. That is awesome. And in the meantime, serves as the editor of Golem Zine, a publication spotlighting unique pockets of the Jewish diaspora. So, Rena Yehuda Newman, Julia Hegele, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Good to be here.
Well, let's start by talking a little bit about the report that recently came out in New Voices that you wrote, Julia. Can you tell us a little bit about what the basic findings of your investigative report are? Also, a little curious about how do you do investigative journalism and all that kind of stuff. But tell us about what this report says and a little bit about how you found out this information.
For sure. Well, the report, as the title says, is about uncovering how Jewish summer camps have been damaging towards LGBTQ youth in the past, present, and how they continue to do so. It touches just on like a blueprint layout of on the wild expectations of how Jewish summer camp perpetuates a very hypersexual culture. It touches on how traditions have manifested really heteronormative and hypersexual environments that kids are sort of compelled to be in. It also has collected and details a lot of instances of neglect and abuse that LGBTQ campers have unfortunately suffered while at camp. We have several stories that are specific to certain camps that we profile in the investigation. We also speak a lot at length near the end of the article about steps that camps can take towards rectifying these mistakes and moving forward in the future towards more equitable and safe and loving Jewish environments at summer camp. Because the general consensus of the whole article is we all love camp in big air quotes, but it has been, frankly, a deeply damaging place for a lot of queer kids. And that can't stand if we're going to call the Jewish community something that's accessible for everyone. So the article it wraps up with a lot of notes, a lot of bullet points, a lot of things that we specifically want camps to take away. We speak a lot about those weird binary traditions that no one really clocks as very binary. You've got your like ranch camp weddings. You have like highly gendered Shabbat dress codes. You have boys and girls separated cabins, separated prayer spaces, separated everything. And in terms of specifically like sexual revelations that we came across during this investigation, things that range from games that got really out of hand and have actually traumatized campers, campers being chased around their entire camp in some sort of like messed up kissing booth game. We have instances of campers being misgendered by their counselors, to the point that campers actually had to leave camp. We have instances of really homophobic bullying that enforced social pressures on people who are struggling with coming to terms with their sexuality. And we also have instances of legitimate sexual harassment or assault that have sort of come to the surface with our interviews.
One of the things that I think I want to highlight about this particular investigation and why it seems so significant that this is coming out is because it highlights a lot of things that are happening in camp cultures that to somebody who either hasn't attended camp or is heterosexual might not actually be obvious about why it is exactly that queer youth are being harmed in these environments. And something that, Julia, you really highlight is the way that camp is this really hyper positive environment, right? Everybody wants to be involved in summer camp. Everyone wants to be good at the cheers and wants, the accolades of the counselors, and that there's a real desire to participate and fit into these really intense social norms, of which hypersexuality is actually absolutely one of those social norms, along with really specific expectations about what it means to perform gender. And so for young kids who are coming into camp where the expectation is summer camp is where you're going to have your first kiss, and that's going to be with someone of the quote unquote opposite gender. And that means that on Shabbat, you're going to dress up in a particular way, which is, by the way, very, very much about conforming to specific binary understandings about what formal dress and formal dress codes look like. I was, certainly really struggling with that when I was a camper, that these cultures of what it means to be in or out is a huge part of the way that queer youth are experiencing exclusion in these really, really subtle, ways. Really, one of the things that stood out to me was later in the investigation, where you highlight that many campers' first feelings of coming out, or first experiences of their genders or sexualities at camp is guilt. That you feel guilty because you're going to disrupt the environment, that you're not going to allow the boy in that cabin to have his first kiss with you because, it turns out you're not interested in him. Think about his feelings, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's really the ethos behind it. And the way that the assumption of an intense type of heteronormativity that's part of the enthusiasm of camp ends up meaning also that same gender assault and harassment is happening, and counselors don't recognize it as that. Because, as one of our interviewees said, it's just boys being boys, right? Or, the desexualization of young women also means that when young girls are having these experiences with each other, and sometimes they are non-consensual, they actually, like most of these children, as it was reported in the article, don't even realize that they had their boundaries violated and that they could have expected better until much later on. And a lot of that is also because staff isn't prepared to have these conversations with campers, and administrators aren't prepared to have that conversation with staff.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to say at the top, first off, I'm just really grateful that you published this. I think that needs to be said because it's an act of courage. And I wish it weren't an act of courage. I wish it wasn't that rare for Jewish publications to write things that are challenging of Jewish institutions, but especially for a small Jewish publication like New Voices to make the move where you would really say loudly things that are not going well in Jewish summer camps. I just want to compliment you for taking that initiative, because not everybody would. Really, not everybody would. The next question I have is, given that, how did this report come to be? And maybe this is geared a little bit towards Rena Yehuda as the editor of New Voices magazine. What was the process that led to this report being released?
So back in fall 2021, the SRE network, the Safety, Respect, and Equity Network, which is an organization that works to do gender justice and stop sexual assault and harassment in the Jewish world, had an open granting process that New Voices applied to. We are incredibly lucky to be recipients of this grant, which has allowed us to have an extra budget to do work specifically around issues of gender justice and sexual harassment and assault in the Jewish world. And so as part of that granting process, I looked at the investigation that we had published last year, which was about how Jewish youth groups are breeding toxic hookup culture and sexual environments for Jewish teens, and really wanted to expand out the universe of work that investigation really broke into. There have been people who have reported on instances of sexual assault and harassment in Birthright, that there are inklings about the fact that something really needs to change in terms of Jewish youth sexual culture. But as somebody who myself is a transgender writer and editor, issues of gender justice are really, really close to my heart. And being in an editorial position in the 2-year span that is the New Voices editorship and has been for the last 50 years that the Jewish Student Press Service has been publishing, I figured that this was going to be the work that should probably define my career, at least with this magazine, and that the investigation into toxic hookup cultures in Jewish youth groups really opened up a lot of doors to a lot of other topics, right? We had people writing in that was, well, why didn't you cover NCSY? Why didn't you cover Jewish summer camps? Why didn't, there was some stuff in there about queer youth, but there wasn't, that we have limited word count. And now that we have the funding to be able to employ journalists to go really deeply into these topics, each of which deserves serious investigation and serious time. God willing, I really hope that this report will actually open up the doors to having much more serious reports from other news magazines and people who have made their careers as journalists, and perhaps even investigations on a legal level. These are serious incidents, and these are serious things that the Jewish world has swept under the rug. And issues of LGBTQ struggles and assault and damages at these institutions has literally never been talked about. And the number of people who wrote into me after reading this article to say, I didn't read this article expecting to see myself in it. And I remember all of these things I haven't thought about in years that happened to me that I didn't even know at the time were so not okay. And it was our hope. We wanted to get this out before Staff Week began, because it was our hope that this would be able to touch Jewish summer camps in time to potentially make a difference for all of the LGBTQ campers who are heading off to camp very soon and deserve to be protected in their summer experiences.
So I think one piece of this report that is important, at least from my perspective, I see this as a beginning of what needs to be a really intentional and probably pretty long process of radically restructuring what camps look like. And by the way, this is about Jewish summer camps, but I don't think that either of you are claiming that these aren't also the case at other summer camps. I think that the fact of the Jewishness does bring up some specific kinds of characteristics that you can totally feel free to talk about. But this is something that needs to happen across the board with summer camps and, as your other article showed, with youth groups. But I want to add a layer of complicatedness, which is we're talking about LGBTQ youth, right? And I've said this on the show before, that 5-letter situation is often used as almost like one syllable word, LGBTQ, one thing. And what I love about this report is that you actually go into specific details about how different people who are L or who are G or who are B or who are T or who are Q, you actually give some color to each of those pieces, because honestly, in the long-term process, I actually think we're talking about multiple different subsections of a bigger restructuring. Because the issues that affect a non-binary camper, the fact of a boys and girls side of camp that enshrines binary gender literally on the geography of the property, that affects somebody who is trans, or, by the way, who one day will realize they're trans, even if they haven't yet as a camper. But to distill that into a hopefully not too overwhelming question, can each of you talk a little bit about some of the pieces that specifically came up as related to the sexuality, letters, L, G, and B, and also the gender letters of transgender and queer?
From a very personal perspective, I was looking for a lot of B representation on my side, because the devising process of this article, even in just a few emails between me and Rena Yehuda, I was I realized that I had some of my own stuff to unpack through it. So we have voices from people who identify as bisexual, people who identify as trans, people who identify as non-binary, people who identify as gay in the closet and out of closet at camp, and making sure that we had all of those voices present. It really does add a weight to this, because it isn't an acronym. These are individual lives that can't be reduced to some sort of just flag word. They have names and they have experiences that happen to them. So each one is very unique and fraught in its own way. You have instances the person who uses the name Asher in the article, who was consistently misgendered at Ramah and the Rockies to the point that they actually left camp the next year. You have instances like the person whose pseudonym is Daniel in our article, who had to actually run away from people at camp because there was a game that was enacted that if you could kiss him, you won points, but boys' points counted more because he actually liked those. There are instances of girls feeling like they should accept same-sex attention, even if it was non-consensual, because they should be lucky that they're getting some play. So many people have responded with similar stories. And I think that getting those specific stories out and making sure that they held their weight as individuals, it's really important to get feedback on this article to have things move forward in the future.
One of the things that I find the most interesting about this article is that I think that this is an article about gender and about how gender interacts then with sexuality. A little bit of sort of basic gender theory, right? In a super heteronormative culture, being queer or having a queerness of sexuality, even if you are a cisgender individual, means that you are not actually performing your gender properly. Because the notion of being a cisgender man or a cisgender woman is that in order to correctly be a man or a woman, you have to be attracted to the quote unquote opposite gender. And so in all of these situations, and one of the reasons why I really, Julia, I have loved the analysis that you've done that ties in all of these different factors, right? We have stories from everybody who is across this spectrum of various identities, but they're not so segregated from each other. And I think that's really important, right? Especially for me as a trans person, I often see cisgender gay and lesbian and bisexual folks trying to sever themselves from trans people and the trans struggle, when in fact, actually these things are deeply interrelated, right? And so the issues that are being brought up even by cisgender queer kids, regardless if they were out or not at camp, are actually issues about the way that their gender nonconformity vis-a-vis sexual expression was being punished. And that these are experiences that are actually universal to queer youth, right? Regardless of it's because, you had a gay kid in the article who wanted to paint his nails and all of his counselors discouraged him from doing so, to a young trans or non-binary camper who is really struggling with dress codes for Shabbos and Shabbos walks, that all of these things are actually about the ways in which gender nonconformity in a super binaristic camp environment is being scrutinized and is being punished, whether explicitly or implicitly, by peers and by staff and by the actual structures of camp in general. This article also comes out on the heels of a massive wave of anti-transgender legislation sweeping America right now. The right wing right now is really hell-bent on making trans people the new American scapegoat. It's a very dangerous time, actually, to be trans, despite the fact that there's really high visibility. Visibility does not equal safety. And so the stakes to this article are actually about how do we allow people to have the gender and then by extension, sexual expressions that they need to be in order to self-actualize. And how do we make camp a safe place for that? But increasingly the rest of the country, especially for Jews who do not live in liberal or urban environments, it is actually not a safe place for them to be themselves.
I want to say, first of all, for folks who are listening to this and haven't read the article yet and imagine that maybe it's like some kind of J'accuse, like tear down the camps article. It really isn't. It's an incredibly beautifully written piece, sensitively written piece. And I would imagine that both of you were heavily involved in making sure that it was that way. It's really just exposing that there is a problem as opposed to pointing fingers in some kind of accusatory way as to whose fault it is. I really appreciated it from that standpoint. I'm curious whether that was your intent. But I guess I'd be interested in your thinking a little bit beyond the article here and saying, are we looking at a situation in Jewish camps that is just kind of representative of a larger situation in society? And I'm not talking about the right-wing anti-trans stuff that we should talk about too, but I'm just saying that I think that there's a lot of people that kind of, they mean well, they think that they're making a good environment, or, even the parents of the kids who are sending them there. And the way that I read the article was that there are these really important issues, and it's not that people are thinking about them and then dismissing them. It's like they haven't really done the work to rethink how camp should function, which is very different from when these camps were invented, which is when my parents were the age of camper. So we're talking 2 generations ago. And so I'm wondering, I guess, if the situation in Jewish camps is worse than in camps in general or in other kinds of contexts. When you did the article on the hookup culture in the youth groups, it was like that was kind of like a scandal. It was like these terrible things are going on. There's points for who you hook up with, and this has been going on for decades. And that this should not be tolerated. Whereas here, I guess my question is, are we looking at that, or are we looking at something like people really need to do some heavy lifting to reimagine the sector of the Jewish world, and they haven't done it?
Well, I would just say it's not scandal. This article has been received as less scandal because people don't care about queer people as much. Truly, I think that the investigation into hookup culture in Jewish youth groups was received that way because it's affecting straight youth, which is the majority of the Jewish community. And in general, when we had to consider, how we were going to take our tone for this investigation, and Julie and I had many conversations, we wanted it to be as constructive as possible. It's really important that this article highlights a lot of solutions for people who are interested in changing camp cultures. I think that there are a lot of administrators out there who are very serious about wanting to do this work. Then again, it was also very difficult to get administrators on the record. And Julia, you should speak more to that later in this interview. But part of the reason why this hasn't been received as scandal is because on some level, everybody knows that queer kids are being abused and nobody cares. It's painful. It's painful to think about. And I've wondered often if this article is going to receive the same amount of attention that the previous one did, partially because it seems like it is touching on a quote unquote more niche interest, despite the fact that queer Jews are everywhere and we are in all things.
The realization that people aren't registering assault as assault, specifically when it's between queer campers, that's something that has to shift. That's something that camps genuinely do need to work on, and out with camps, all space, Jewish or not Jewish, because the things that are happening to children are being washed away as something to be expected or something to be happy about or something that's completely platonic. But in reality, the way that we like sanitize children's sexuality, the way we sanitize queer children's sexuality, all of that completely disenfranchises these kids. So they're coming back 10, 15 years later and realizing that what happened to them was actually unacceptable. And those who went to staff were met with sort of like a numb response of like, well, what can be done? That's just what it is. So that absolutely has to shift.
I also want to observe part of the reason why I think also camps have not necessarily wanted to touch this issue is because acknowledging LGBTQ campers means that we actually have to have a serious conversation about youth sexuality. And the fact that just when someone hits the age of consent is not the age in which suddenly you realize that you experience your own gender and sexuality. And that means that also camps then have to create policy around how they're talking to children about this, around at what ages are kids getting education about consent, about their own genders and sexualities, about how to interact with other campers, and about the social norms of camp. And that's a complicated question. That's a really high stakes question. I don't necessarily have amazing answers about what exactly needs to be done, but as long as the issue stayed firmly in the realm of talking about straight kids, generally, it meant that we didn't have to talk about it as explicitly. Mm-hmm. And and I think that that's actually a lot about heteronormativity, is the notion that we can make a lot of assumptions about how people are experiencing gender and sexuality. And that means that we don't actually have to talk about it explicitly in order to keep people safe. And queer issues and acknowledging the presence of queer people at our institutions and in our communities means that we do actually have to talk about sexuality, and we do have to talk about youth sexuality.
Let's talk about that, because I'm curious from you, like who doesn't care? Like, are we talking about camp administrators and staff and funders? Are we talking about parents? Are we talking about the wider Jewish community, funders? I mean, because I guess I'm saying that, like, I do think that there's a lot of people in the camp world that I imagine will read this article and they will care. Because I was sort of interpreting it more that there is kind of a sense that we really ought to, but we aren't sure what to do, or we aren't maybe prioritizing enough. Look, I mean, part of the idea of this podcast is sometimes that, you know, we've talked about the idea of universal design, where things are being created from the beginning with and for the people who were previously peripheral or seen as marginal. And the wondering is whether the other is even possible. But I think that the premise behind this article is a hope that it is possible, that camps can do something that will fix it. So I guess I'm wondering, both in terms of before you wrote the article, but definitely in terms of the feedback that you're getting, are you feeling like the camp world of administrators itself is not interested in doing better?
I think the camp world itself just didn't want to speak about it. I think it's really important to note the timestamps on all these interviews. They came out from people who were campers or young staff members in the early 2010s, who are only reckoning with the things that happened to them in the early 2020s. So people who have grown through the past, I would say, like 4 years of gender sexuality discourse becoming slightly mainstream, people who have access to the resources that can allow them to understand that things have happened to them. The way that camps in the past have like minimized, muted being able to speak about sexuality or your gender, I think that's where camps sort of flounder. It's not necessarily that they had like an insidious plan to sweep all of this under the rug per se, but there's a culture of silence that's really prevalent that's only just now being wheedled at by young workers at camp. Administrators, even the best ones, are doing half the work of young queer counselors now who have experienced this stuff as campers. And so I think the power dynamic really has to even out. This can't fall to the administrators, because the administrators, frankly, won't ever be able to understand what's happened to these kids. They need to be able to supply the resources and the energy for these, again, children, these young adults, to be able to articulate what they need and what they think camp should be.
One of the things that is the most significant about this article, and I think what it really highlights in why these things have been happening to queer youth over the last several decades, is that it's more about neglect than it is about an act of malevolence, right? I think the vast, vast majority of camp professionals are seriously interested in seeing this change. And there's no doubt in my mind that a lot of the people who, even if they didn't speak on the record, are seriously committed to changing youth cultures and to making sure that camp is safer for all people. And that was a huge part of the reason why Julia and I, when we were talking about the tone of this article and how we were going to be unveiling this, is that this isn't meant to be a gotcha Jewish summer camps. But to some extent, also when you are advocating on behalf of a marginalized group, unfortunately, sometimes you do actually have to do what you think is going to be the most effective, even if it means sometimes putting down the anger and the pain of what the experience has been. But the ways in which the harms that have been done are non-obvious, right, and happen in subtle ways, is part of the reason why this is difficult to talk about. It's not active abuse, but it is neglect. And the way that these issues have been deprioritized and repeatedly deprioritized, even when you do have young campers and staff members who are repeatedly saying this needs to change, it always seems to be a little bit second down on the list.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I want to distinguish, I mean, we've used the word caring and talking about whether people care. And I think there's two different ways that we could mean that, right? There's people who read this report and think, wow, this is terrible. And by the way, including like camp professionals. There's caring in the sense of like personally being touched or moved or angered by this article. Like if you're a camp director, a camp assistant director, whatever, and like you know this is happening, you might care in your head. You might be upset. You might be frustrated. But then there's the level of caring that, I don't know, maybe capital C caring, where you demonstrate that by moving from a place of I'm really upset about this and I wish it were different to we're going to make policy changes. We're going to change the structures of our camp that are leading to this. I mean, by the way, I'm thinking about my own camp, which I've talked about on this podcast in an incredibly positive way over and over again. Like, I love my camp. Hey, Camp Interlochen, love you to pieces. You, I've said and will say again in the future, are the single most formative institution in my creation as a human being. I actually think that. I spent 13 years there, living there every summer. And I am 100%. So first off, I remember literally being a participant and a witness of things that absolutely would fit the category you're describing of like assault that we didn't even realize was assault. Same gender events where people were like encouraged, or maybe not encouraged, but like ended up touching one another in ways that in another context we would totally call assault. But at camp, it was like, well, we all love each other and like there's a lot of touching and like it's normal and it's okay. Like I absolutely observed that both as a camper and, I'll be candid, as a counselor, as somebody who was the supervisor. Like I reflect on my own presence in those spaces and I don't think I acted adequately. Now, would I blame me as like a uniquely terrible person? No, I would say that I was never trained to be looking for that, really. I mean, I was a little bit, but not very effectively. And to the extent I was trained about like the hypersexuality at camp, it was totally through a heteronormative lens. And given that I want to bring up potential responses of a camp director or a camp staff or even a camp counselor or something who hears this and is like, I care, right? But like there's something stopping me from the next action. And there's two that are coming to mind. One is, well, wait a second. Like most kids at camp are straight, right? We live in a culture that presumes everyone is straight until they actively say they're not, right? Like you have to come out. I never had to come out as straight. I was presumed straight, and that was true when I was born, and it's still true today because like nothing has happened to change that. And so at summer camp, everybody is presumed straight except for maybe a few people. I mean, when I was there, it was only a couple people. It's probably more now who have actively come out. But still, if we were to judge like who's straight, quote unquote, by who will be LGBT or who's queer, right? Like by who will identify as queer 10 years after they last set foot on camp, I can tell you the number that is really big based on my own camp experience. I know a lot of people who nobody at camp had any sense they were gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, or queer. And now that's how they identify. And not only do they identify as that now, they understand that they were when they were growing up, but they either didn't have the language for it or they weren't comfortable sharing that. And the second thing is that I think there's a lot of camp directors who, when they hear this, they're like, well, we have different camps that do different things and have different cultures, and some of them are more progressive and some of them are less progressive. Like maybe a few Jewish camps are at the place where they could make the kinds of radical restructuring that we're calling for. But like, we more mainstream centrist Jewish camp, like, I don't know if we're there yet. And I'm curious how you would respond to those kinds of claims, that this is something that maybe some camps should work on, but not all.
I think in terms of that last question, the range of camps is pretty emblematic that this is an all over Jewish summer camp problem. So we have instances coming in from Reform Jewish camps. We have instances coming in from Jewish community center run camps that aren't affiliated with a specific denomination. We have ones coming in from the United Kingdom's majority movement. We have camps from all ranges of the country, all different denominations. The article, I think, pieces out quite well how this problem really doesn't belong to a specific subset of Jewish summer camps. It's like it's there in everyone.
I also want to speak to the universality of this issue. Queer people highlight a lot of issues that actually impact everybody. It's just we don't have the privilege of ignoring it in the way that straight people often do. And so what that ends up meaning when we're talking about youth sexuality at camp as it relates to queer kids is actually really about how do we create environments where kids feel, specifically Jewish kids, get to feel safe in exploring their bodies, their genders, and their sexualities in ways that protect them. But this is true of all kids. It doesn't matter what they grow up to identify as. It's about how are we making an environment where all of these kids feel safe? Because we could have run the same investigation about how straight kids are impacted by this culture as well. It would have some different takeaways. It would have some different focuses, but everybody is impacted by having a hypersexual, heteronormative culture in which staff and administrators are not trained in talking about sexuality and consent with campers. I do really want to highlight the huge part in this article that is about how staff are not trained to be able to deal with instances of sexual harassment and assault among campers, that campers don't know that they have resources that they can go to, and that there is, as Julia said, there's this culture of silence around any issues of gender and sexuality, and that hits queer kids the hardest, but it impacts everybody. And to respond to the most kids are straight piece, most kids don't know what they are at Jewish summer camp. Kids don't know their genders, their sexualities yet. They have feelings about it, right? It's experiences that they've had. They largely don't have the language. They're probably not getting that education from schools. And unless they're as lucky as I was, they definitely weren't getting it from their synagogues. People don't know what they are, and camp should be a place where they get to discover and explore who and what they are. One of the really beautiful things about camp is that in so many different ways, camp is a place where people get to explore their Jewish identities and figure out who they are Jewishly and as members of the tribe. And that should extend to all other aspects of who we are as Jews, because we don't set down those identities when we walk in through the camp gates. Every aspect of Jewish people need to be protected at Jewish summer camp. And that means experiences of gender and sexuality that are at our most formative points. This is really an article about how to make sure that everybody is safe and protected and getting to explore these things, because youth sexuality is going to happen. It's going to happen in these environments. It's a question of how prepared are we? How do we make people feel safe and protected in these environments? And how do we really make sure that everybody gets to have the experience that they deserve to, because camp actually should be for everybody.
You know, what you're saying obviously is something that I agree with. And I just wonder whether it can be achieved. Like, Lex, to what you were saying, that camp is the most impactful thing that ever happened to you. What if the only way to achieve that is in a way that damages a lot of people? Then I think we would all agree, like, we should give up the thing that transformed us so that it won't hurt others. Or there's some line there where the transformational good is not outweighed by the harm.
I think, first off, the idea that camp being good for one can come at the detriment of another. No one's camp experience is like made or defined by the counselor wedding. No one's camp experience is defined by what you have to wear for Shabbat walks. It's defined by the community that you build along the way. So the idea that that community would be so obsessed with these teeny tiny traditions that are peppered all throughout camp that we think of as synonymous with camp, but that let's be real, can be removed from the camp space and nothing will change, is such a disenfranchisement to all the kids that are made to feel uncomfortable by those things. It's the walks to the water fountain. It's getting to pray together. It's things that have no gender to them, but that are ruined and tarnished by the omnipresent feeling that there is a gender hierarchy, that there is sexual pressure to conform to certain things. No one's camp experiences is based off of like a 5-minute nighttime activity. So taking that nighttime activity away for the betterment of the kids that are too afraid to come out or that are visibly uncomfortable, in my mind, is absolutely worth it. Camp was the best experience of my life. It's the place I felt most in touch with my Judaism. It's also the first place I ever came out, and it went really, really well. I was really supported by my fellow staff. I came out to some campers and they were like, good for you. It felt very validating. And I'm still aware, I'm still unpacking a lot of the things that I saw at camp and the things that happened to me at camp that made that queerness, that made my visibility compromised, that made me feel unsafe, that made me feel like I didn't belong there. But none of that had to do with the people that I was with or the space that I was in or my ability to feel Jewish or my ability to feel like I was at camp. It was the night activities. It was the little things. It was the constant wear and tear of the heteronormativity that we've just accepted as standard at camp, but in reality can absolutely be changed with no detriment to the greater camp experience.
We don't really have the option to just throw up our hands.
Yeah.
Because, if Dan, perhaps you could, snap your fingers and Jewish summer camps would suddenly dissolve. I'm not sure I would necessarily wish it. I think that youth affinity spaces for young Jews are really important. We haven't been historically in positions where queer people have access to major institutional resources, where we feel like we're able to actually make spaces that are for all of the people who have felt disenfranchised by major Jewish institutions, especially because we're talking about queer youth, which is to say kids who don't know who they are yet, who are having these experiences, who are not being protected, right? I love what Camp Tawanga is doing. I'm so happy that there are these places that are really great affinity spaces for these kids. And also the vast majority of kids will never have access to that, whether for geographical reasons, for financial reasons, or because they didn't know that they were queer at the time. And so they just ended up going to some other camp, right? And so this question about like, well, should we just toss out the whole thing? Like, look, there's a part of me that's very much a revolutionary in this way. And I do think there are a lot of things that we need to build from the ground up, but we actually can't afford to take that attitude because the number of people who will be left behind and damaged, if we just say, well, this whole project isn't worth saving, it means that all of those other kids are going to go down with the ship. It's part of the reason why I came back to be on staff at the summer camp that I grew up at, where like, this was really difficult for me, right? As a young gender nonconforming kid, summer camp was one of the places where I really discovered myself. And I had come out between the time that I was a camper and when I decided to be a camp counselor. And in order to be on staff, I offered this, that I would give a whole staff training to the entire camp staff of Olin Sang Ruby Union Institute about trans and queer inclusion. I was 19. They did not pay me for that labor. That's tough. But as much as it was tough for me to be on staff as like the first out trans camp counselor at that camp, I'm really glad I did it because I still get messages from kids who were campers, both in my unit and not in my unit, who said, me seeing you gave me hope that I could become the person who I wanted to become, to believe that I actually had a future. The number of people who feel like because they actually don't have queer models that they can't have a Jewish future and a Jewish life, it's a devastation that I've personally felt.
I'm really in agreement here. And I just to like really get concrete for a second, if you're a non-binary 7th grader, I don't know what my camp that I went to would do if you wanted to go to summer camp. Like all of the cabins are girls' cabins or boys' cabins. Now, I say 7th grade because, well, actually, that's no, even a 9th grader, that would be true. 10th grade, I'm just talking about my particular camp. There's different camps with different norms and different structures. My camp, the 10th grade, is actually a more gender mixed environment. It's called Kfar Noir, and it's like you're actually sort of sharing. You still have gendered yurts, but at the very least, most of your programming is all gender. Now, at the time, we would have called it or thought it was, co-ed or two gender. But like truly, sincerely, if a non-binary camper who is before 10th grade applies to my camp, I think what they would be told is, we'd love to have you, but you have to be in a single gender cabin. And my guess is, and this isn't about just my camp, it's probably true of almost all camps. My guess is they would basically be told the gender that they were assigned at birth. Like, I think that would probably be the preference a lot of the time. And that would basically be denying the non-binariness of that person. And so, like, there are foundational changes that need to happen. But I am really in agreement with Julia when you say, like, I don't think they're foundational to what camp should be. Now, I think they are foundational to what camp has been. Like, Absolutely. For me, when I look back at my own experience, I literally think through my morning till, like, wake up till going to bed. My days were almost entirely with boys, or at least people who identified as boys at the time. And that was the norm other than mealtime. And by the way, I was sitting at a table with other boys, but I was in a big dining hall with all genders. So still gendered, even there. And then evening programs, where it was often all camp. All of my activities, even the activities that weren't officially gendered, like the sports activities, were boys' activities. Did anybody ever announce that? No. But was the structure of the camp such that, like, if you were a girl who wanted to play ultimate frisbee, like, everybody in that activity would treat you differently, either be condescending or why are you here? Like, condescending meaning like, oh, do you know how to throw this way or whatever? Or just like say, why are you in this? You should be in like the arts and crafts activity. And so my question, I guess, is like, given that we don't want to just throw up our hands here, what are some practical steps? I mean, you mentioned that some are at the end of the article, but like, what are some practical steps that camps might take? And I'm curious if you have some that like literally might be possible to do in like a few days, like quick things that could make a big difference, and also much broader things that would be a longer process.
Right off the top of my head, combine your activities. They don't need to be like girl cabin, boy cabin, girls going to arts and craft, boys going to horseback riding. I mean, horseback riding, it's difficult with the horses, but like boys don't have to be mountain biking. Girls don't have to be arts and craftsing in separate little bubbles. Have them make crafts together, have them go mountain biking together. It might come down to resource that might make that difficult. Make the groups smaller, split them in half. We waste a lot of community when we segregate boys and girls and leave those who don't identify with either sort of floundering in the middle. We waste a lot of like communal connections, all that jazz out the window. It goes away when we don't let kids play together because they are just children. Other options, any explicitly gendered activities, we've spoken at length about the camp wedding. Scrap it. Think of it. It sounds like kind of blunt, but just be creative.
And just to be explicit there, like, I really think that relates to some of what came out in that earlier article about continuity and how so much of the framework of these camps and other Jewish youth organizations is very much about like creating next generations, seeding the numbers of the Jewish future. And so weddings, it's like, of course you have a camp wedding because you want people to like be imagining that thing and then like the reproduction that follows.
Right. The primary issue here, right, when you're outlining that it's getting Jews together in an environment so they might know that maybe they can get married and have babies, is all just euphemism for sex and sexuality. Exactly. Jewish sexuality isn't going away, right? That's not all, like it is for the vast majority of us, a part of our experience. Even for people who identify as asexual, they have to interact with people who are experiencing sexuality, and a culture that really encourages that it should be front and center in their lives. And that means that ultimately what we need to be doing is shifting the conversation away from quantity of sexual experiences, which is the baby maker philosophy, which is a deeply misogynistic idea behind Stephen Cohen's work, the notion that Jewish cisgender women are just uteruses to be incubating the next generation of Jews. But from a standpoint of Jewish sexuality is a part of the world that we live in. And it is a part of the Jewish community. And so instead of it being this thing that's just about how can we make more Jewish babies and implicitly convince everybody that they're straight so that more Jewish babies can be made in this very specific context and in this very specific way, it's actually about how do we create better quality of experiences that allow people to have their own bodily autonomy, that allow people to feel empowered with the ways that they ask and give consent, And Jewish summer camps are often the site and source of where people are having those first experiences. And so all of the things that Julia has just outlined of these really simple things about like, let's just degender some of these things that are actually part of the hypersexualization of camp. Those are some really basic steps that people can make. Those are some really easy ways that camps can actually make these changes, even if it doesn't seem that easy right now, considering how entrenched it is. But we're also talking about policy and resource shifts, right? That means that each camp needs to actually have a statement about how they are talking about gender and sexuality at camp to campers. Because most of this neglect and abuse actually happens when there isn't a conversation about what kinds of touching we consider to be camp appropriate and not appropriate. What does consent look like, or what does it look like to have a personal bubble that you respect with all people, regardless of gender, and being able to choose if you want that person to kiss you, or if you want to hold hands with that person, or if you want to go on a Shabbat walk, right? That it doesn't mean that we should be erasing the fact that gender and sexuality are a part of these camps. It's about protecting the fact that these are formative experiences where kids deserve to get to learn that actually being a Jewish community means that you have people respecting your body, that you have people respecting your experience of gender, that you have people who are respecting the fact that you are experiencing sexuality in all sorts of ways that you might not have labels for yet, and that this is a place that you will be safe to do that. That there are adults who are going to take care of you, that there are adults that have policy under their belts that can explain these things to you. It means training staff members. It means actually allocating resources so that you have advisors. Each camp should have at least one person who is the head of queer inclusion. And frankly, these are also issues of race and class, right? Who feels comfortable at camp is often also divided along issues of diasporic identity, racial identity, class identity, ability status, right? You could write an investigation for each of these different categories. And that means actually putting resources to make sure that camps are informed and prepared for all of these kids when they come to camp, regardless of if they know who they are yet or not.
I'm thinking through steps that maybe like that I would try out. I mean, first off, the first thing I'd say is like, there's a lot of Jewish camps. And if we saw this as a system-wide, for lack of a better word, like system-wide issue, if each Jewish camp tried certain kinds of models, we could actually learn a lot about the kinds of things that work. And look,
Amen.
I think there's a truth to the fact that like at one camp, implementing every change at once, like that I do think that might not be something that's easy to do in an effective way. But if everybody, heck, you could even break it down. If every Reform Jewish camp if you broke down, you know, however many Reform Jewish camps were, and you had like 7 or 11 or whatever the number is, like different focus areas that people tried and modeled at each of those camps, and then they report back, like, then you could implement the solutions that work really well. And you could say, you know what, this we thought might work and it didn't. And I mean, honestly, part of what this points to for me is in the way that Rena Yehuda, you were talking about how this is not just about queer campers. Like myself as a straight cis white guy at a Jewish summer camp, like I spent most of my days with other boys. And I also spent not that much meaningful time with people who were very different from me age-wise. And like to the extent I did spend time with the girls' cabins, quote unquote, it was like my sister cabin. It was my own age, and you referenced brother cabins, sister cabins in the article. And there's something that like feels inherently, even if you're trying not to, a little sexualized about putting the kids who are the same age in a program that like, if we had more cross age time where like the younger campers and the older campers were sharing space and those spaces were mixed, like all gender, that, I don't know, there's something that tells me that would maybe work in terms of desexualizing some of these things. Like some of the sexual dynamics of a 9th grader being with other 9th graders are not arising, I mean, God willing, are not arising when a 9th grader is with the youngest campers. And so like that kind of solution, it both seems like it might work. And I look back at my experience and I'm like, I would have loved as a 4th grader to hang out with the 8th graders. Now, would the 8th graders have loved to hang out with me? I think some people listening might be like, oh, they don't want to. But when my camp every once in a while, rarely had those kinds of, I don't know, age-queered gatherings, for lack of a better term, the feedback tended to be that the older campers actually loved it too. There's like this, oh, you're like a built-in mentor. I don't know. Something tells me that might actually be part of the answer here, is eliminating some of these delineations we have that aren't just gender, that are like by age cohort or that are by, I don't know, by other things. Are there other practices that like some camp could try out, and not that we're going to claim it's a solution, but that like we might sort of carry out in a few environments and see how they go?
I mean, I feel strongly that every camp or every unit in every camp should have at least one all gender cabin or tent. A lot of this is not also about completely eliminating the presence of gender and gender affinity at camp, right? I think it's really important to say that for a lot of people, and especially for young queer kids, actually having gendered affinity spaces are sometimes the most formative experiences, right? Like it's not for nothing that we experience gender identities, right? This is not I am not a gender abolitionist. I don't think that this is the end of gender. I think that this is actually a reimagining about what it means to understand ourselves as having agency in our relationships to gender. Every camp should have an all gender cabin. Every camp should have clear and explicit policy about sexual harassment and assault that needs to include and have a mind to the experiences of kids who are same gender, quote unquote. We need to make sure that every staff has particular advisors to be able to talk about these issues. We need trained social workers on camp who are able to respond to kids when these things inevitably do come up, right? I know that Keshet is doing really great work around this. I know that there are a lot of organizations. I mean, even Moving Traditions, I believe, has some work that they're doing, right? Employing and putting resources to making sure that during staff week, people are receiving trainings about this that are mandatory. This is all about keeping kids safe. This is really about keeping kids safe. And we can't keep kids safe if we're not talking about youth gender and youth sexuality.
I think camps also, if we're going to bridge the gap between people who have felt disenfranchised by their time at camp, there needs to be some sort of outreach to alumni that isn't just asking for money. There needs to be some reparative justice done towards the queer individuals who have felt attacked or victimized or who have been assaulted at camp. Right now, you have people like the people in this article who loved their time at camp, but feel deeply, deeply disconnected from it as an institution, or who have since felt ostracized from the greater Jewish community because they have nowhere to turn with these issues. They have no one who will accept the idea that camp actually has harmed some folks.
I think it was really devastating for a lot of sources who spoke about their experiences at these camps to see that their camp didn't respond for comment.
Yeah.
And it makes them feel like they didn't matter. It has really serious effects on people's spiritual lives about whether or not they even feel like they can be in Jewish community going forward as adults. Camps are obligated to speak up about this, right? There's a certain amount of it that I'm willing to say was just, there wasn't policy and these things fell through the cracks. But now we know that this is an issue. Silence is no longer an option.
So that's a great segue into just a brief conversation, and I hope we can have a longer one in the future about Jewish investigative journalism, because I think that it's awesome that you're doing these investigations. It's awesome that somebody gave you a grant to do that. But the whole idea of New Voices is it's journalists that are, just in college or just recently out of college, I think 18 to 24. I mean, it's awesome, but it also feels like that's also work that should be done across the board by Jewish journalism. And yet I also understand. I mean, I understand in the sense that my brain comprehends it. I don't understand it in the sense that I have an approval for it. But I understand the reason why they generally don't, which is, I think, two things, or maybe three. One is they're, I think, afraid of losing their sources of support, whether that's funders or subscribers or whatever. But I think that more broadly, they have a sense that that's not the role of Jewish journalism, that somehow the role of Jewish journalism is to be sort of part of the project of Jewish continuity and affirming and, informing, but it just doesn't seem to be the ethos of Jewish journalism to really do serious investigations. Maybe they also don't have the resources to do it, but it just doesn't seem to be the ethos to really go in and kind of expose what's going wrong. Now, I think that if they found that there was like corruption, they probably would. If they found that the head of a federation was, pocketing the millions and, in a Swiss bank account, I think that they'd feel comfortable doing that. But I don't think that they seem to think that it's what they should be doing to kind of go inside of the way that Jewish organizations are doing the kind of Jewish part of their work or the human part of their work, and calling the public's attention to that they're not doing it as well as they could.
Look, New Voices magazine is the official publication of the Jewish Student Press Service. The Jewish Student Press Service was founded in 1971 as a wire service to connect Jewish magazines that were cropping up all over the country, largely during the anti-Vietnam War movement, the civil rights movement. Right, we have our roots in the New Left, and so New Voices, when it began being published in 1991, has been on the forefront of a lot of progressive Jewish writing that folks who have previously been in my position as the editor-in-chief, which is a generally 2-year position for somebody who's just out of school, have often been in a position where they are speaking truth to power. This magazine is really about talking back to the Jewish establishment in the way that only young Jews often can. I can't speak to why the broader world of Jewish journalism doesn't investigate issues like this. Sometimes I wonder if it's maybe because the affiliations are too close together, or everybody knows somebody who's part of this organization, or that there's too much interpersonal interlocking in ways that it might become difficult for people to actually seriously re-examine these things. You're raising an interesting point about how much is Jewish journalism there to be critical to the Jewish establishment rather than to just create a modern understanding of the Jewish people. I think it really should operate as doing both. And I hope that New Voices really exemplifies that, right? In both that we have writing from authors who are trying to talk about their Jewish experiences and the things that they are cultivating, the communities that they're creating. We have, a campus and community section where folks are talking about that in their immediate communities, but we also really strive to continue the investigative legacy of the Jewish Student Press Service, where because we are young Jews and because many of the people who come to write for New Voices are also people who have sometimes felt disenfranchised by the broader Jewish institutions. That is a trend. That is a part of the history of New Voices, that many of the people who write for us are people who have experienced themselves to be outsiders. And when you find yourself on the edges of the camp, it actually means that you are in a better spot to do tochacha, to do rebuke of the broader Jewish community, because you understand that it is not complete. You understand that there are people who do not feel at home there, and it puts you in a better position to actually be able to say, hey, we need to expand the margins of the camp because we've lived here and this is not tenable. As this investigation hits the airwaves, and certainly this happened with our previous investigation, we hope that this is opening a door. Right. Julia has done a phenomenal job of outlining and doing an incredibly critical analysis about how queer kids are being harmed in Jewish summer camps, which also extends into the broader world and is applicable and even in non-Jewish institutions. And the hope for this article, which could not cover everything and could not go as in depth as we wanted it to, because 7,000 words is really long already, is that this opens up the door to other people who are professional journalists and other people who are really passionate about queer representation, inclusion, as well as what it means to actually expand the notions of who feels safe and comfortable in Jewish community, to actually do more work into this. That we hope that these investigations open up a door, that this is not the end of the story.
Thank you so much, Rena Yehuda and Julia, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, that you've learned something, and that most importantly, you'll head to New Voices' website to read the full investigation. It's definitely worth your time. Send it to folks you know who work at Jewish camp or who have influence in Jewish life. This is something that we all need to be talking about and acting on. So we hope that you'll head to newvoices.org. You can also give them some support by heading to newvoices.org/donate so that this kind of investigative work can keep happening in the future. A few notes about how you can be in touch with us, Judaism Unbound. First, there's our Twitter, Instagram, Facebook pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, you can head to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. Third, you can email Dan or I at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. And we appreciate it if you're able to donate to support us as well, which you can do at JudaismUnbound.com/donate on either a one-off basis or a monthly recurring basis. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound. 100 more days of Shemitah.